Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I'm Bob Allison, president of the Society. The Colonial Society is a scholarly organization. We do have seats here in front. Founded in the early 1890s by a group of gentlemen who were miffed that they never could get elected to the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm pleased to say that barrier has since been broken, and we do have a number of joint members as well as joint programs such as this one. The main thing the Colonial Society does is publish primary documents. We publish over 100 volumes of early American history, including the papers of Thomas Hutchinson, and forthcoming we have the papers of John Hancock, as well as Daniel Gookin, 17th century commissioner to the Indians. So we continue publishing, and we continue having programs such as this one, probably not as interesting as this one, that's been put together really by my good friend and colleague, Kid Wangzor-Chanele, who is the Director of Research at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Kid is a Civil War historian. However, he does great things with early American history, including this program. So I'm now going to turn this over to Kid.
All right, thank you, Bob. All right, everyone. Well, welcome to the Colonial Society for this program, co-sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. The microphone is for our friends online, so if you don't hear an amplification in the room, that's all right. It is a joy to always be back in this space. When Professor Mary Beth Norton came to us with the idea for this program, I said, the perfect venue for this has to be in this wonderful parlor, Beacon Hill. And so we hope you enjoy the program. We really want to thank the folks at the Colonial Society for hosting us up here. This is one of many programs that we've worked together on. So it's my role to just introduce our presenters and performers today, and then I'll turn it over to them. But the author we are here to celebrate is Mary Beth, Conlon Alger Professor of American historians, among others. Her book, Founding Mothers and Fathers, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1997, and her 2020 book, titled 1774, won the George Washington Prize as the best book on the American Revolution published that year. She has held fellowships from multiple organizations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, sponsored her work, as well as the Rockefeller and Guggenheim Foundations, and also the Princeton or Huntington Library and Princeton University. She is an elected member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. She is a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society as well as the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and has regularly done research at the MHS since she was a Harvard graduate student in the 1960s. At the 2025 Harvard commencement, she was awarded a Centennial Medal by the Graduate School honoring her accomplishments since her PhD in 1969. Our performers are Laura Rocklin, who has performed, and
Is that what they said?
Okay, all right.
Hello. We are
Laura Rocklin has performed with theaters across the country and worked as an historical interpreter at museums up and down the East Coast. She is a company member of the Chesapeake Shakespeare Company and at History at Play. Laura's full-length plays have been produced by the Classic Theater of Maryland, Chesapeake Shakespeare Company, and Ally Theater Company. Her first-person historic character portrayals have been presented for educational groups on both sides of the Atlantic. Laura holds an MFA in creative writing from Emerson College and an MFA from the Academy for Classical Acting at the George Washington University. Jeremy Beasley is a Boston-based actor. Some latest productions include Art Class, Tartuffe, Grand Horizons, The Glass Menagerie, It's a Wonderful Life, Murdering Marlowe. His film and TV credits include WTC View, The Game Killers, and Whoopi, as well as numerous national and regional television commercials. He grew up in New Albany, Indiana, learning and performing classical theater, making independent movies, and playing in rock bands. Jeremy is a graduate of the North Carolina School of the Arts. Peter Drumming is the chief historian.
It's true.
Peter Drumming is the chief historian at the Massachusetts Historical Society, responsible for library outreach and exhibitions. He has transcribed historical documents and written manuscript collection guides and subject surveys, including Collecting History, a guide to landmark documents and artifacts at the Massachusetts Historical Society. He has served as a technical advisor for documentary films and television programs and offered commentary on various media platforms. Today, he will be a technical advisor and offer commentary for life advice. For more than 40 years, he has helped over 50,000 researchers at the Historical Society. One of those researchers is our author today, Mary Beth, who we now welcome to take the floor.
Right, thank you. We will be back. Whoops. Oh, there goes the...
I got it.
I moved it to this pocket. There it goes. So the subject today is the Athenian Mercury, a two-sided broadsheet published in the 1690s in London, begun by a printer named John Dunton. Dunton, in his autobiography, which is one of the earliest autobiographies printed in English, was published in 1705, and the title is The Life and Errors of John Dunton, tells us that he was walking in the park. This is his most prominent and successful publication. Tells us he was walking in a park in London one day in the spring, and he got the idea for the Athenian Mercury, which he calls the Question Project. Today, it's known as the world's first personal advice column. Wikipedia says that, if you look it up in Wikipedia. It was also, interestingly enough, as an answer on Wait, Don't Tell Me. When I was working on the book, I thought it was somehow meant to be. But what's interesting is that it was not intended to be the world's personal advice column. It was the readers who made it the world's first personal advice column. Because John Dunton's idea was that people would ask questions anonymously. They would be answered by John Dunton and his two brothers-in-law, who declared themselves the Athenian Society and claimed to be an organization of experts. There was mystery membership at first. Nobody knew who was printing the Athenian Mercury. Dunton used a fake name on the early copies. No one knew who the members of the Athenian Society were, and eventually there were people who wrote in and said, "Can't I join the Athenian Society?" And they always said no, although they did occasionally consult experts on certain topics. But it turned out to be the longest-lasting periodical in 17th century England. It was published from 1691 to 1697. Now, when he's talking about the origins of the Athenian Mercury in his autobiography, Dunton doesn't mention a coffee house, but surely he had just left one. Because as historians know, people or men hung out in coffee houses in 17th century London where they had wide-ranging talk. And when you're having wide-ranging talk, as we all know from any conversations that we have, things come up that people don't know the answer to. And there was no Google, or there was no Wikipedia in the 17th century. And so really, Dunton's idea was to provide something like that, was to provide a way for someone in the 17th century to have a search engine, to say, okay, none of us could know the answer to this question, and so here's the question anonymously to the Athenian Mercury, and the Athenian Mercury would answer it. And the idea was it would come out the next week because there would be a short interim period? Well, as it turns out, there were so many questions that often the answer was delayed, and sometimes in the letters, if you buy the book or read it, you will see that some people say, I've written to you several times, but you haven't answered it. Please answer me now. So clearly they were getting letters that were pouring in that they were not dealing with. But the original idea was someone would ask a question in one issue and get an answer in the next. And they expanded it to 2 issues a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays. And they sold for a penny each. They were hawked on the streets of London as individual broadsheets, and they were also hawked in coffee houses to the men who hung out in coffee houses. And that was the original audience, the men who were in coffee houses. That gave them the idea. And so the Athenian Mercury called for questions, said, we'll answer questions on religion, history, and science, and so forth. They didn't answer questions on politics. When they did actually answer one question on politics, the censor suspended the publication for several months. So they learned their lesson. And even though censorship was suspended in England in 1695, they still didn't answer questions on politics. But they answered questions like, did Adam and Eve eat actual apples? Or, why do dolphins follow ships around? They dealt with questions like that. And there were questions and answers like that that continued. I'm not talking about those. People who are interested in the Athenian Mercury can actually read all those questions, but I didn't deal with them. What I was interested in was the personal advice questions, which they never intended to answer. But everything changed in the 13th issue of the Athenian Mercury, so about 6 weeks in. They got a series of letters, a series of questions from a man who asked general but relatively personal questions, like, don't women and men marry too young? Or, don't women and men marry too often for money? Those kinds of questions. And they answered those questions. So the very same issue, they said they had gotten a letter from a lady in the country. And, whoa, this was amazing. A, it was someone in the country, not from London. They were really only intending an audience in London. And 2, they were never intending to write to women. It was an audience of men. And in fact, the first kinds of answers on the other kinds of questions often have a kind of, shall I say, male jocularity to them that is not really included in this book because that's not the questions I'm interested in. So they began to answer the kinds of personal questions that they got, despite the fact they were criticized by some people who wrote to them saying they shouldn't be doing this. A, they shouldn't be answering questions to women because weren't those stupid? And they said, no, women are just as smart as men. We can answer their questions as well as men's questions. And they also got people who wrote in and said, why are you worried about the family? Why are you worried about these kinds of personal relationships? Because those aren't relevant, or they really destroy your learned reputation. And they said, no, the family is relevant to the nation. The nation cannot survive without families and family relationships, and so it's okay for us to answer these kinds of questions. So they defended themselves, even though they never really intended to answer those questions. Now, there's a scholar who's a British scholar named Helen Berry, and it was by reading her book years ago that I found out about the Athenian Mercury. She wrote a book about gender and the Athenian Mercury, and that was relevant to the book I was working on at that time. She actually sat down with a sample volume. I'll tell you what a volume was in a minute. Sample volume, and she counted the topics of all the questions, which must have been really tedious, and I bless her for having done it, so it meant I didn't have to do it. But she discovered that about 30% of the total questions that were asked in the Athenian Mercury were personal questions. So 70% weren't. So we're just ignoring all those 70%. We're only talking about the personal questions. Of the personal questions that she found, 40% of the authors identified themselves as men, 25% identified themselves as women, and the others were unclear what the sex of the writer was. And again, we have to understand they're all anonymous, so you have to believe what the person is saying. If the person says, I'm a young man, X, then there's no way of discerning that that's not true. Now, Dunton created these volumes after about every 20 numbers, so about after 10 weeks. He would bind the broadsheets together into large volumes, but sometimes he added supplements because there were so many letters that he would add them that they were never printed separately and sold on the streets, but they were just bound into the volumes. And then some of the volumes had indexes, so men sitting in coffee houses, because that was the place that the volumes were sold, would be able to look at the index and see, oh yes, in the last volume there was a question about X, and that's my interest, so I can look it up, or a question about marriage or whatever. So I found, as I said, the Athenian Mercury through Barry's book. I was working on my book, Separated by Their Sex, when I was living in England, teaching at Cambridge University in the year 2005, 2006. So this has been in my mind for 2 decades. That book was published in 2011. I was absolutely fascinated by the letters on love and marriage, which Barry dealt with. It's not that she didn't deal with them, it's just that she dealt with them in a scholarly way, and with particular emphasis on women and gender. So I kept the idea in mind until the pandemic in 2020, when I decided it would make a fun project to work on. I could do this because, in part because Cornell University Library has about 8 of the bound volumes, so I could work in the rare book room. Once the rare book room reopened after the start of the pandemic, and it did, you had to, you don't want to know, but you had to sign up and nobody else could be around and so forth, but you could still go in and read the books. And then I did it partly online because there are 2 databases that include the individual letters. Interestingly enough, the volumes all have introductions or prefaces, but the things online do not ever copy the introductions or prefaces. So to see the prefaces to the volumes, you actually have to have access to the printed works. And the prefaces have a lot of interesting information in them about the kinds of letters they're getting. I mean, sometimes the guys will say, don't ask us these joke questions, or don't send any more math problems, or something like that. But you don't see that unless you see the prefaces to the volumes. So for my book that was published in 2011, I had taken extensive notes, although I hadn't really transcribed things word for word, but I had hired a student to transcribe from a later collection of the book, of the letters that came out in 1703, 1704. John Dunton went bankrupt and had to sell the copyright, and he sold it to a guy named Andrew Bell, and Andrew Bell put together 3 volumes called the Athenian Oracle. And Cornell University had those 3 volumes called the Athenian Oracle, and I had already, years before when I was working on the previous book, hired an undergraduate who was at Cornell for the summer to sit there in the library and transcribe those letters. So I had transcriptions, formal transcriptions of the letters from the Athenian Oracle that were relevant to my interests. So I started from all of those. This book has no footnotes. It's the only book I've ever written. Well, it has one footnote. It just says how to get to the originals. And it's unlike anything else I've ever done. It's intended for readers of all sorts, not just for historians. And in my previous books, I've always maintained the traditional spelling and punctuation and so forth, capitalization and such. And when I started to work on this book, I did the same thing, although I cut extraneous phrases. But I gave it to my brother to read, and he said, oh, it's just like reading Shakespeare. And I thought, no, that's not going to work. Because 17th century prose can be very convoluted, with very long sentences, with different words that we're not used to, with strange capitalization, punctuation, and italicization. And so for the first stab, I just sort of cut the long sentences, and I didn't do much rewording. And my own publishers, I published both Alfred Knopf and Cornell University Press. Neither of my editors were interested. And I knew I needed an agent. I'd never had an agent before, so I got an agent through a friend. The agent and I then developed a more formal proposal with an introduction and a sample of edited letters, and he sent it out repeatedly to history editors without success. Months would pass, and I wouldn't hear from him, and he said, well, this person liked your introduction and didn't like the letters. that person liked the letters and didn't like your introduction, so all we need is somebody who likes both. Well, we found that person who was a literature editor, not a history editor, a literature editor at Princeton University Press, who liked the idea and was willing to work with me. So with her encouragement, I began much more aggressive editing, more than I've ever done. I modernized all spelling, all punctuation. I modernized word usage by consulting the OED. I changed double negatives to positives. Anyone who's read a lot of 17th century documents knows they're full of double negatives. I changed those to positives. I cut more phrases than I'd done before from letters, from questions and answers alike. And where everybody tended to be long-winded, it didn't matter whether they were asking questions or answering questions. They were all very long-winded. So when we organized the book, my editor and I did so in a series of chapters on the different topics that came up everywhere. Courtship, choosing a spouse, getting parental consent, making promises and vows to your beloved, and those turn out to be really important, marriage, and dangerous liaisons. And dangerous liaisons is, well, that was my editor's title. I called it illicit sex. And she titled it Dangerous Liaisons. But you get the idea. That's what that chapter is. So these topics show us that the people asking the questions, who John Dunton referred to as quirists, and you will hear that word in some of the letters today, the quirists tended to be youthful, at least those who asked the questions on these topics. Now, how old the people were who were asking the questions on other topics, I have no idea. But it seems as though these particular topics, love and marriage, drew young questioners. And I just don't know about others. And are these people representative? I don't know. People ask me, are they representative? I don't know. Are they making it up? I don't know that either. They just say who they are, and you just have no alternative but to think that they're telling you the truth. Unless sometimes people wrote in and said, I'm writing for a friend. And the Athenians always saw through that and said, and would respond to that person directly, usually. See, these do seem to be upwardly mobile tradespeople. Sometimes some of them had more money, because there is occasional discussion of how much money they have. But we just don't know how accurately they represented everything, except that maybe as a whole, we can take them as representative or as indicative of certain themes in 1690s London. So in my editing, I tried to maintain the flavor of the prose, and so far readers seem to agree that I managed to do that. But some historians, I will admit, have questioned my choices, which I actually anticipated. I thought my friends would nitpick me on various things. And I'll just tell you about one of them. There's a woman who asked, or there's actually two women, and they give essentially the same answer to them. They ask, how can I find a husband? And they say, go where there are the fewest women. And therefore, they say, go to the plantations. And I thought people would not understand that, so I changed that to colonies, which is true. And I do know from my previous work that single English women did sometimes come to the American colonies to look for a husband. But there were friends of mine who quarreled with that and said I should have left the word plantations, but I thought too many people wouldn't understand what it meant, that it meant anywhere in British America, not just the Caribbean, which might come to mind. I did maintain other words, though I didn't change other words. I maintained, and you'll hear this in the letters, I maintained the word friends with a 17th century meaning, which is parents, relatives of all sorts, and not just congenial contemporary friends, but rather parents. A lot of times the word friends means parents. And then another word I didn't change was spark. The Athenians referred to young men who they didn't like very much as sparks. And these were the men who were courting women who were asking whether they should believe these guys. And so I maintained spark. I actually was going to change spark, and my editor said, no, keep it and just explain it. So I do. Now, the Athenians prided themselves on being open to women, and they usually were quite even-handed in their responses. They gave the same or similar advice to male and female quirists. They were actually less misogynist than others at the same time or later. For example, The Spectator. Addison and Steele, who are very famous writers about cultural and gender things, are far worse than the Athenian Mercury in terms of gender relations and what women should or should not be doing. John Donne himself was a great advocate of women's education, and that's not in this book, but it's in my other book, and it's in Helen Berry. So here's the format for the rest of this afternoon. We have selected 11 pairs of questions and answers. I will briefly introduce the themes and then comment after the answers, and our performers will perform, and then there will be a general question and answer at the end with me and the reenactors. So I would like us to, if they'll open the door and come out, the reenactors to appear. Okay, so the first question this afternoon that we're reading is one of the very first questions asked by that man, the original anonymous male quirist who seems to have started this whole thing. Go.
Is it permissible to look with pleasure on another woman than one's wife when married? Or, before marriage, a woman other than one's intended spouse?
It's dangerous, the eye being the burning glass of love, and looking, liking, desiring, attempting, and criminally obtaining, oftentimes, or always, follow one another. But if it is possible to stop at liking, which is the last step that can be taken short of a precipice, we do affirm that is permissible.
Okay, so questions like these continue. That is, the ones that have personal themes but are not directly relevant, or you don't seem to be directly relevant to people. But the ones that interested me and that fill up most of the book are the more specific ones. So the next two questions raise serious courtship issues. One is offered by a woman and one by a man. There are lots of courtship questions, and they show that the quirist, as I said earlier, if most readers were young. So, Jeremy.
Is interrupting discourse by repeated kisses rude and unmannerly and more apt to create aversion than love?
Not so hasty, good sir. You have made great progress indeed in your amour. The truth is, kissing is a luscious diet. He must therefore remember to feed cautiously, as if he were eating melons. Moderation verily is an excellent thing, which he must observe, and kiss as well as talk with discretion.
Go ahead, Laura.
I see in some of your former Mercuries that you blame the female sex for being too credulous and wonder why we aren't more careful about whom we believe. Pray be so kind as to teach us your skill. When a man courts us, how shall we know whether it's for marriage or for diversion or for any other reason?
So difficult a question that we believe many a man can scarce resolve it himself at the time of his courtship. Like other common swearers and liars, he might have told his tale so often that he believes it himself. There are indeed so many equivocations in love that it's much easier to be in the wrong than the right. We must therefore return to our old infallible rule. If a man does really marry you, you may believe that he courted you for marriage. But woe be to you if you believe him upon his word and honor, faith and conscience. Parcel of strong words in the matrimonial service will have and hold him to the grindstone where all other lies are easily broken as made. Then it's 10 to 1 that he forsakes you, laughs at you, and exposes you into the bargain.
So both these types of questions are typical. That is, men tend to ask questions about conduct in courtship, and women want to know whether to trust men. Sometimes these are specific men whose behavior they describe in great detail. And usually in such cases, the Athenians say, don't trust them, dump them. So, okay, our fourth question is a joke, which the Athenians recognized and treated as such. And they occasionally dealt with joke questions, or even more serious ones, in a jocular manner. In this case, I can envision the guys making up this question, sitting at a table in a coffee house, joking about the friend they're asking it about.
I have an earnest request to you on behalf of a young gentleman. He has a very good estate in money, is well built, has a very comely face, and an excellent head of hair. This agreeable person desires you would oblige him by helping him to find a wife equal to him in those respects.
We believe his character is too well known to succeed in the search among his regular acquaintances, or else he'd never address such a request to strangers. But perhaps a woman might be in similar circumstances. Therefore, being charitable, we are willing to bring the fools together. And in order to do that, we think each of them should publish their names either in the Gazette or by a common cry.
So a public personals ad, in effect, is what they recommend. And now we have a question from a man whose parents won't allow him to marry the woman he loves. And here, watch for that word friends, by which he means parents.
I love a young lady so much that, though I frequent the park and the playhouse, I cannot meet there anyone whom I find nearly as handsome. Her charms have absolutely possessed my heart. I cannot begin to love another, but my friends won't let me marry her. What shall I do to divert myself and make the time seem shorter till I can marry her? I would join the army, but my relations deny me that too. If you will, gentlemen, instruct me by a speedy answer.
Poor man, will no new face cure you? If you are willing to follow the wise advice of your friends, for they know the world better than you, and will endeavor to disengage yourself from the young lady, travel, if that is permitted by your relations. Observe all the curiosities you meet with, but if your affairs won't permit it, study history first, which is diverting, and then follow as your interests direct you. By all means, avoid idleness in the sight of the lady or anything that may remind you of her. Find some agreeable, ingenious acquaintances who have conquered Cupid and know how to value their freedoms. If you follow this method, a little time will infallibly recover you.
So that answer, giving alternative strategies to heal a broken heart, is typical for women too. It's the kind of thing they say, actually they often say read history, but nothing amorous, they say to women. Don't read amorous history, but read other history. And, do other things, hang out with people who have different interests and so forth. But the next answer to a woman is unusual.
It was my unhappy fortune to be courted by a gentleman that all my friends are extremely against. They sent me away from him thinking that absence might part our affections, but it had no such effect upon either of us, but the contrary upon me. Now this person is come to the place where I am and renews the same thing again. I cannot withstand him. Gentlemen, give me your advice, whether in conscience I may marry this man without sinning against God and disobeying my parents, for they are still against it. I'm willing to obey them, but how might I gain their consent if possible?
You ought not, nor can you in conscience, surrender without their consent. Yet if the gentleman is really a deserving and suitable match, or he lacks only an equal fortune to yours, and has enough comfortably to maintain you, we'll tell you the most likely way to work upon them. Go to your mother first. If she love you best, as is usual, fall upon your knees, shed tears plentifully. They'll cost you nothing but a little ringing and a few hard faces. and tell her you can be happy with no other person. Add that although you'll not marry him against your parents' consent, you are resolved never to marry anyone else. You can entreat her, as she ever knew love herself, to pity yours. If you once melt her, let her alone with your father. This way, if any, is like to prevail, and may probably obtain you their consent to make yourself miserable.
Now notice that last one. They often say that kind of thing to the young people who write about how can I marry the person I love, and then they'll make a comment in the last little bit saying, now you're going to be miserable because you're going to achieve this goal. But in any event, they don't usually make the kind of specific suggestions as they did to this young woman. And what they do often say, though, is to remain single. If you can't get your parents to agree to the marriage you want to make, remain single until your parents die, and then you can marry anybody you like. So, now, spousal choice questions are pretty common, and the quirists give descriptions of their options, sometimes long and jokey ones, and we're not using those, but you can find them. So, this one includes a joke.
I have an equal passion for a virgin and a young widow about the same age with equal good disposition, beauty, and education. They both love me equally, and I may marry either when I wish. The virgin has 500 pounds, the widow 700 pounds. The widow has 2 children, but they're provided for. I am not in debt and live very well by my profession, but I must marry one of them. I'm equally in love with both and don't know which to choose. Pray, tell me what you would do were this your own case, and what you would do to advise me. Your opinion shall be the guide to the entire future happiness of the most passionate, distressed, and most confounded lover on earth.
And perhaps you'll be just as wise as before after our sage advice. Widows are cunning, but she can't deceive you in one respect. The widow has 200 pounds more, but then she has 2 children. They may be provided for, but they are still her responsibility.
Let me just add a little bit. Beware of cunning widows. That's something
Among all the woman's accomplishments, you say nothing about wit. If there is a difference, that decides the case. Choose her that has the least. 10 to 1, the other will think she has more than you, and may take pride in outwitting you. But if they match in mind, estate, wit, disposition, and all, certainly their caresses must differ. But if that doesn't decide the matter, we can think of only one key difference. Choose her that's short, for her clothes will cost less. And if both the same height, what chance to stop?
Now, I have an addendum to this. Just about 3 or 4 days ago, I was talking to one of my neighbors who was reading the book, and she had just finished reading this particular answer. And she said it resonated with her because they had just bought clothes for her husband, who's very tall and who was standing there as we were saying this. And this was a good idea, she thought. Now, there are frequent questions about marriage and money. And the first one today is from a man.
I have loved and am beloved by a gentlewoman of whose virtue I am very well satisfied. I have long courted her, but without proposing marriage, for that would be very disadvantageous to me. Now I've met another woman of whose love I'm pretty well assured. The question is, should I shun the first, whom yet I love best, or no? If I marry her, my friends will oppose the match, which I fear would ruin me. If I marry the second, they would be extremely pleased, for she has a considerable fortune and friends to help me. But then I must fear the ruin of the first, for she has a passionate esteem for me.
It would be best if people would consider their circumstances before they give too much liberty to their passion. Since in love as in war, if they once engage, it is very difficult to make an honorable retreat. Not making a formal proposition to the First Lady does not matter, since courtship and keeping her company are sufficient to engage you too far to break off without her consent. If you can persuade her to release you, a request to which surely a sensible woman would agree when a man desires it, it is best to marry to your greatest advantage. But if she refuses you, you're obliged in conscience to marry the first lady, or at least to remain single, whatever damage you may sustain by displeasing your friend.
So there are a couple of frequent comments in this response. They frequently counsel discretion about people entering into serious courtships. They be careful to think about all aspects of things before you seriously start to court somebody. And this interprets his previous behavior as an implicit commitment, almost as serious as some kind of a formal vow and promise to her. So their insistence on the agreement of the other person is common. And they know, and note what they say. They say a wise person will agree to let you out of this agreement because if you don't want to marry her, she won't want to remarry you. But you do have to check with her. So there's a lot of these kinds of responses where they say you need to have the other person agree if you want to break off a relationship. So this is pretty common. Okay, then we have a woman and money and marriage.
I'm the wife of a person of considerable estate and quality. Before I married, I was courted by one much below me, and being overcome by his importunity, promised him marriage. But before the wedding date was set, I was addressed by one with a fortune far beyond what I could ever expect. And being ambitious of riches, I soon married him, unknown to my former suitor, who, on hearing thereof, was much surprised and accused me of horrid baseness. This is now nearly 10 years ago. I'm so disturbed in my mind for what I've done that I dare not receive the sacrament until I know how to reconcile myself to God and to my much injured love. Pray let me have your advice as soon as possible, for I live in the country and am now just going out of town.
In the first place, you did very ill to forsake your first lover if he gave you no provocation or just reason, especially on the account of a fortune. But marriage is like being born. When once it's done, there's no undoing it, unless death loosens the hold. You do ill in putting God and your much injured lover so near each other in your thoughts. Rather ask pardon for the wrong you do your much injured husband, thinking so much of any other.
So I'll just make this one brief comment here that, of course, in this answer you get an indication of the fact that there really is no divorce in England at this time. So if you marry somebody, that's it, you're stuck. And there is, people can try to reach what we would call a separation from bed and board by going to an ecclesiastical court, but they'd have to prove adultery, and nobody could remarry, either the innocent person or the person who was the culprit cannot remarry. So basically, we're talking about a situation without divorce. So the final two questions we want to do are two very different questions, but they turn the tables on the quirists in interesting ways. They don't always accept the premises that they have been given, and I find these among the most interesting answers that I've printed in the book. So, Laura.
You are desired to give a reason why most men before marriage try to be agreeable and good-humored, especially during courtship. But when once they achieve their aim of marriage, they grow morose and careless. And that which seemed the only object of their wishes becomes often their greatest aversion, or at least indifference.
Suppose another quirist should ask the same about the ladies. Why are they less careful to please after marriage? Then the same answer might serve for both. They have caught the fish, and the net may be thrown under the table. But there are other reasons. Difficulty whets, sweetens, and endears. Satiety cloys. Before marriage, all put their best side forward, but afterwards, persons are more intimately acquainted. 1,000 little cross accidents sour both parties. Both sides must make allowances for the faults that they want if they want to live happy. Possibly they expected more from each other than is to be found below the moon, and therefore are angry when they find themselves disappointed and mistaken.
Okay. Our final letter from Jeremy.
I, having spent some of my estate, was forced to take an employment under the king, which caused me to leave my family. I, being placed in a town, one of the young ladies fell in love with me. I told her I was married and had several children, but she importuned me to marry her if my wife should die. I promised. And after 4 months' time, I was removed to another place. Being there about 1 month, a widow of about 40 years old fell in love with me. This widow never had any children and has at her own disposal 150 pounds per annum. The other has but 60 pounds per annum. I, having promised both, I desire your answer in your next, which I ought to have when my wife dies.
Final answer. If you will forecast the future in this way, think what a choice your wife, that you now have, ought to make amongst the numerous suitors which she will have when you are dead.
So as I said, we'll have a question, and if you have questions and answers for any of us, and were we going to move stuff around or not? Are we going to stay where we are?
I can pull the chair forward for you if you'd like.
Yeah, I want to sit down. So, but I think if I sit down here, I'm out of the picture. So we need to move the podium.
We'll do that.
Sure. Here we go. I can assist you if we bring it back here.
Yeah.
Now I'm called behind.
And then we can move this over there.
The ornamental.
Is this okay, Bob? Okay. Okay. Questions. And we will offer answers, maybe not as funny as the Athenians did.
Sadly.
Yes. Oh, are we going to have a microphone for the? Yeah.
Here we go.
For the questions? Yeah.
Well, first, I knew Peter was a reliable source of information on everything, but I never knew I could turn to him for this sort of advice.
That's true.
Maybe you have a new function, Peter.
But my other question was, when you had these inquiries, did you ever have, like the person then receiving the reply, did you ever have a follow-up of the person saying, you advised me, and then...
They do say sometimes, we would like you to tell us how things happened, how things turned out, but they never do. Nobody ever does. There's never any follow-up, except there's one set of 3 letters that are related to each other, and that's all I found in all the 6 years. There are occasionally people who write and say, this letter that was published on X day reminded me of Y, and that sort of thing. But in terms of actual follow-ups, no, just this one set of 3 letters, which is long and involved. But it has to do with courtship, with a woman writing in. Actually, she's had an illegitimate child. She's had a child with her lover. She's desperate. He will not pay attention to her. She's contemplating suicide. And they basically give her a hard time because they're very moral. Then they run the same letter again exactly a week later, re-edited, and they never admit they've already answered it. And this time they say the guy's a jerk, which they didn't say the first time. And then the third letter is from the guy. He says, I am the unfortunate man, and he tells the story. He wants to marry her, but his parents won't let him marry her. It's one of those questions, one of those situations. And they say that it will drive them to their graves if he marries her. But the Athenians, interestingly enough, say, you know what? You two are married in all ways that matter. Forget your parents. Act as though you're married. And then they say, tell us how this turned out. But I have no idea. That's the only follow-up.
Do you have any letters from parents about their children not listening to them?
Yes. There's a very funny letter from an older man who complains that his widowed son with children has remarried without asking his permission, and they say, wait a minute, this guy's an adult, he doesn't have to ask your permission. Yeah. And there's other kinds when they do say essentially the same thing, although not from parents. That is, it'll be from an older person who not necessarily wants to remarry, but let's say an unmarried woman who is successful in business and wants to marry somebody, and her relatives are against it, but she says, do I really have to pay attention to them because I'm an independent person? And they say, no, as long as you're an independent person, you can do what you want. So, yeah.
This might have something to do with the age of the inquirers.
Yes.
I'm just shocked at how open they are. And were there any promises of confidentiality, or were there an expectation?
Everything's anonymous, so.
Yeah.
Everything's anonymous. And the letters do not survive.
Okay.
The original letters do not survive.
But there's a postal service that delivered the letter.
No, they mostly hand-delivered the letters to a coffee house.
Okay.
That's how they got the
okay.
letters. The letters were to be addressed to a coffee house. Primarily, they would have been hand-delivered, I would assume, because the recipient had to pay the postage in England at this time.
Okay.
So, John Dunton didn't have a lot of money to pay, so it had to be. People, I think, hand-delivered the letters to the coffee house, to a coffee house that Dunton used as his mail drop, as it were. So, no, but it's all anonymous, and so nobody knows who anybody is. And I find this very interesting because people have said to me, you know what? Today it's stuff that you might talk to a therapist about, but in fact, some of these letters are quite shocking in what they reveal, and I think that individuals would not have revealed them to their friends or to their relatives, particularly in some cases. For example, there's a man who in effect confesses to a rape, and he says he feels really remorseful about it, and he wants to make amends, and so they offer him some suggestions about how he can make amends. But I mean, I can't imagine a letter appearing in a modern advice column saying that. So, I mean, I think a lot of the letters are like things we would read today. The answers are somewhat different, and the problems are somewhat different, or some of the problems are somewhat different. But I do think that people guaranteed the anonymity of the Mercury, admitted things that people today would not admit in advice columns. I've never seen the kinds of things that some people admit to. There is one woman, I'll just tell you this story because I like it. The woman writes in and says, this guy is courting her, and he tells her about all his conquests, all the women that he slept with, all the married women that he slept with, and she says, is this right? I mean, should this be happening? And they basically say, again, they turn the tables, and they say, wait a minute, what if you said things like this to your lover? How would he respond? And so dump him. I mean, they're very good about telling women to dump jerks. So. I think there was another question.
What do we know about John Dunton's own love and
marriage? That's a good question. John Dunton had a wife who was a very good financial manager. We know that because once she died, his finances went to hell. And he did something the Athenians told people not to do. He married a second wife for money, and that marriage did not last. The second wife's mother, who was a widow, a wealthy widow, realized that Dunton had married her daughter for money. And so Dunton basically spent the last years of his life in and out of the poorhouse, in and out of being cared for by other people. He never had children himself. His brothers-in-law had children, but he never had children. And so basically, that's why the Athenian Oracle is published, because he sells the copyright to Andrew Bell. He publishes his autobiography in hopes of making some money, but in fact, he's not very successful. The Athenian Mercury is the most successful thing he ever published. He claimed later in life in his autobiography, he claimed, or even later in life, he claimed to have published 500 books. He probably did not. There's been a study of his publications, and it's thought he maybe published 200. But I mean, he was a very prolific printer, but he never made a lot of money. So, but that's a great question. I might add, one of his brothers-in-law admitted to philandering, and the other brother-in-law had 17 children. So.
Question, getting back to your previous comment about confidentiality. And
Yeah.
I mean, you're comparing this with things like Ann Landers,
Right.
that kind of thing, but so many online discussion sites,
Yeah.
complete anonymity,
Right.
no cost to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Could be.
even, sometimes people have under their name, they may develop a character and
Right.
acquaintances,
Right.
but they can still set up a sock carpet to
Sure.
ask other questions, and some of those can get really out of hand. I mean, have you thought?
I haven't done anything about that. No.
Yeah,
Actually,
it feels much more like that environment.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. Some of you might have seen there was an author in the New Yorker in the June 23rd issue who talks about my book. It's more than a review. She uses it as a discussion of advice columns in general. And she talks about a Reddit site that I never knew about called Am I That Asshole? where people ask questions about what horrible thing I did and was I really bad to do this. And so I thought that was great. I've never heard of that site before. But yeah, that's exactly what you're talking about. Yes. It's true. I'm talking about sort of traditional advice columns.
So after the Mercury went out of print,
yes,
where did all of these questions, which very obviously exist and people were really eager to find answers, what happened when they...
Well, as I said, a lot of them were published in the Athenian Oracle.
Oh, okay.
And so, not all of them, but a lot of them were published in the Athenian Oracle. And I did, because of the blessings of keyword searches that one can do on America's historical newspapers and on early American imprints, I was able to track the presence of the Athenian Oracle in North America up to the 1790s. It was offered for sale. Benjamin Franklin offered it for sale in the 1740s, and it was quoted in various publications over the years. In fact, well into the 19th century, there are quotes that appear attributed to the Athenian Oracle. And I actually end the book with this, I don't know, it's kind of sad. There is a guy in Philadelphia who runs a newspaper who's who gets a copy of the Athenian Oracle, and he's very interested in it, and he publishes some letters from the Athenian Oracle, and then he asks, does anybody know anything about this society? And no, as far as I can tell, nobody answered the question. Mm-hmm. So, and that was in 1801 or 1802, something like that. So it was forgotten. Yeah.
Apart from the people who submitted questions, what was the public reaction? How was this perceived?
Oh, it went viral. It was very popular. I left that out completely. It was a cultural phenomenon in the 1690s. There was a parody in the form of a play. There were other groups that tried to start similar publications that didn't succeed. And it was all over, and that's why it was so popular. That's why people wrote in and said, "Can't I join the Athenian Society?" It was really the whole thing about the play is amazing. So yeah, I don't know that the play was ever performed, but what's it called? The New Athenian Comedy, I think it's called. You can find it online. I did read it, so yeah, it was a real cultural phenomenon. It burst like a bombshell, I guess I would say, on English culture of the early 1690s. And then, of course, it dissipated the way things like that do. But it was a very important publication, and that's why it was able to last for so long. It is, as I said, the longest-lasting periodical in 17th century England.
One more question.
Or that's what the literary people tell me. I didn't look that. I just read that somewhere else.
I confess having read Ann Landers and Dear Abby in my
Of course.
misguided youth, but I guess I'm curious about two things that you probably have reflected on in the course of your studies. And the first is, why do you think people wanted the advice of an anonymous source.
Right.
And the second is why they would feel it's important to voice publicly their concerns.
Yeah. Well, let me answer the questions in order. I mean, I think that the time of the 1690s in England is a very unsettled period. Remember, it's after the Glorious Revolution. It's after the Catholics have been thrown off off the throne, and the Protestants have taken over. It's in the wake of the Civil War and the interregnum. So it's coming at the end of a long period of social and political unrest in England. And William and Mary are on the throne, and Queen Mary sets up a society for the reformation of manners. And the Athenians are very much aligned with her goals of trying to get people to have regular marriage. I didn't talk at all about the fact that marriage is not defined in England at this time. There is no law of marriage in England until 1753, and that's 60 years later. So basically, a lot of people write into the Athenians and say, am I married? Or who am I married to? And that's relevant to this. Again, asking a question anonymously of a published source means you don't have to admit this to your relatives and friends. Like there's one couple that is described by, quote, a friend, that are not actually married, quote unquote, by any law, but they regard themselves as married, they act as married, they've had children as married, and what should they do? I mean, can they go to church and take communion? That's the question. We have someone here who's concerned about taking the sacrament. And basically, the Athenians, who are very moral, say, no, they're living in adultery. They have to clear that up before they can take the sacrament. But there are clearly people who are living together who are not, quote, married legally, because it's hard to know what legal marriage is at the time. And you wouldn't want to say that to your friends, or relatives. You know, if you present someone as your husband or your wife, and you've lived that way for several years, you don't want to admit to somebody else that you don't have a piece of paper that says that, or that you didn't stand up in a church and say that in front of a minister. So I'm not surprised by it. Yeah.
When did marriage start?
Wait, take the.
When did marriage start was the question.
What?
So when did marriage start?
When did marriage start?
Well, when did marriage start? Well, at the time, it was determined by the Church of England. And the Church of England had certain rules about what marriage was. And this was from 1604 on. This is what canon law said in England at the time. And canon law said you had to be married by a minister in a church under quite restrictive conditions. And some people could not do that. And there are accounts in these letters of people who have marriages that aren't, what you might think didn't meet those criteria. So are we married or not becomes a question. Just one other popped into my head. Oh yes, there's a form of folk marriage, which is breaking a piece of money with your lover. And that is regarded as marriage by some people, or at least as an engagement. And I found examples of this in my work on the 17th century English colonies, breaking a piece of money. When there were people in 17th century, the colonies, I can't tell you whether it's Maryland or New England, who were brought up on charges of fornication and said, no, we're married. We broke a piece of money. So, that's...
we never thought about it.
Yeah, right. And as I said, there's no English law of marriage until 1753. It's adopted by Parliament. Before that, people are kind of making their own rules in a lot of ways. And so there's a lot of talk in these letters about promises. We promised faithfully to be true to each other. Isn't that enough? Mm-hmm. And the Athenians usually say no, because, of course, one of them is a minister of the Church of England who believes that everyone should be married in church. But the story that I told you before about the young couple that had been prevented from being married by his parents, that's when the Athenians sort of overrode their other rules, and they said, yeah, you're married, forget it, So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Start, yeah.
Thank you.